Okay, well, here we are. Another week of studying political science has been like watching a nation lobotomize itself in real time. The art of the deal seems to have entered its terminal phase. The way the media has been handling this situation as a continuous political emergency has reached a fever pitch, and we've reached the logical endpoint of the art of the deal. Deciding that diplomacy is best handled the way you might negotiate a hotel licensing agreement, unilaterally and in defiance of all established order and conventional wisdom. Entering negotiations with Vladimir Putin on Ukraine while excluding Zelensky and the European Union is a signal of something. It signals either an intentional reshaping of the entire world landscape or a fundamental inability to grasp the stakes. This is not a new feature of Trump's thinking. Trump is simply not ideological on any level, and this is a feature of his politics. As far as I can tell, Trump believes almost nothing. It really does feel like Trump could come out tomorrow and say up is down, or 2 plus 2 is 5. And some people would defend that. What you don't get from a person without ideas is the kind of competent lies that turn Russia or Hungary into dictatorships. Instead, Trump's lies serve as a kind of loyalty test, where you can only function in a Trump administration if you pretend to believe that 2 plus 2 really does equal 5. The consequences of this type of politics is a world in which expertise has become irrelevant, and every issue is reducible to whether or not you bend the knee to certain party shibboleths. Shibboleths like 2020 was rigged. Or my personal favorite, Trump never did that, and if he did, it was taken out of context, and if it wasn't, well, the Democrats do that all the time, and if they don't, that's not Trump's fault, and if it is, he didn't mean it, and if he did, it was actually good he did it, and if it wasn't, then the deep state did it. Trump, as of the time I'm recording this, has just declared Zelensky a dictator, a point that Tucker Carlson made the other week, and Putin himself has made this point. So it's pretty safe to assume that this claim first echoed in the halls of the Kremlin. Even if this were true, and not some odious wordplay dreamed up by propagandists, it's still wrong. It's wrong to make this point now, when Zelensky is fighting Vladimir Putin, who is an aggressive dictator. It's wrong to make this point because it tacitly accepts the Kremlin's view of reality, that Ukraine doesn't actually exist, that its sovereignty is negotiable, that a dictator's territorial ambitions deserve as much weight as a nation's right to exist, that all you need to do is bring in some wheeler-dealer and you'll find middle ground. Which makes me think, what's the middle ground between Putin and Anna Politkovskaya? They're only half poisoned, half assassinated. Does that seem like a fair compromise? Does that seem like the art of the deal? But that's kind of the rub, isn't it? Because to Trump and the MAGA brain trust, there is no meaningful difference between a dictator and an elected leader. Zelensky mobilizes his nation for a total war against a hostile dictator, and elections are suspended due to constitutional provisions. And that situation, the one I just laid out for you, is on the same moral level as assassinating journalists. If Zelensky is a dictator, it's just another meaningless territorial dispute. It's just another European turf war. Those Europeans, when will they ever stop fighting? Part of the reason why I'm so critical of Trump, while being able to imagine that we'll survive another Trump term, is that all he really does is expose the danger we'd be in if a more capable and ideological force like Putin or Netanyahu were in the Oval Office. Moscow has now spent 8 years working the Great Khan on America, that Ukraine's sovereignty is fiction, that it isn't a real country. And then Tucker Carlson and his rogues gallery repeat it, and then right-wing media amplifies it, and then Elon Musk goes on Joe Rogan and does that chin-stroking move, and suddenly an alarming number of Americans see no problem with handing Ukraine to the wolves. For most, Zelensky being a dictator is an assessment that bears no resemblance to reality, but that's not even really relevant, is it? For Trump and his allies, Ukraine is not an ideological battleground. It's a nuisance. It's a campaign issue. It's one that he said he would dispense with. And we know exactly how he dispenses with things. A made-for-TV peace deal, signed with a Sharpie, held up for the cameras. The fact that much of the Republican Party is prepared to follow him down this dangerous path, where America's commitments to its allies are now obstacles, marks the final stage of a dangerous delusion. Putin's ambitions don't stop at Kyiv. If Trump is willing to sacrifice Ukraine, why would he defend Estonia? And if he won't defend Estonia, why would he defend Poland? And if he won't defend Poland, then NATO doesn't exist. The Baltics have been living in the shadow of Russian revanchism for decades, building an entire security apparatus on the promise that if push came to shove, they could hold the line so long as NATO could reinforce them. What happens when that promise evaporates? What happens when the United States decides that defending European democracies is not in its national interest? Trump has framed himself as the no wars president. But the practical effect of his diplomacy is the wholesale liquidation of American influence, auctioned off to whatever dictator or quasi-dictator offers the right mix of flattery and business. The beneficiaries of this reordering are states that have no interest in the American-led world. Do you really want Iran and Russia to have any more say in the price of gas, let alone food? Ukraine is already looking elsewhere, to Turkey, to the Gulf states, to whatever coalition it can piece together, in the absence of America. And if you think that's a good thing, if you made an endless fuss about the billions of dollars in aid being sent to Ukraine that could have gone into your wallet, what do you think replaces the international rules-based order? Do you envision a new multipolar equilibrium teeming with economic opportunity and human rights? Do you think China and Hamas are going to build that world alongside you? The balance of global power does not rest in some noble equilibrium. There is no fair redistribution of influence that awaits us in the absence of US leadership. There is only anarchy, where the strong take what they want. Reports indicate that business dealings were discussed during these negotiations because, well, of course they were. At a moment when missiles are leveling cities in Eastern Europe, when Ukrainian hospitals are being targeted by drone strikes, the US president is weighing how to convert war into opportunity. Putin, to his credit, has made his objectives very clear. This is not just about Ukraine. It never was. His war is against the very idea of the international rules-based order. The notion of democracy, the idea that truth exists. His ambition is not just to subjugate Kyiv. It's to dismantle the post-1991 order, to render the institutions that the US has built irrelevant, to prove that American hegemony was a fluke. The US president is handing him precisely what he wants. If Trump delivers Ukraine to Putin, it's not just the end of the war. It's the end of NATO. The end of America as the leader of the free world. The United States will have abdicated, willingly, its role. The US and Europe have long danced the same dance. It's always been a partnership of convenience for both sides. Europe has always relied on our leadership and our institutions, sometimes with some reluctance, but they were always expecting America to steer the ship. That certainty is gone. One question that I can't imagine anyone at the UN or NATO or even the founding fathers to have ever considered is what happens when the executive branch has something resembling a nervous breakdown. What happens when the imperial president, the man with the nuclear football, offers a buyout to the entire American intelligence community? Europe, with all its history with authoritarianism, they know what it means when the stabilizing force starts to behave like a rogue state. And Europe's response to assemble a peacekeeping force? I mean, are we doing an SNL sketch? lightly armed, neutral European forces standing between the wreckage of Ukraine and the occupying army. This is a deeply unserious idea, and it's a tacit admission from people like Keir Starmer that the US is done with European security, that NATO is finished without a fight, that the architecture of the last 70 years is being demolished and liquidated like a Trump casino. And for so many voters, this is not only their preferred outcome, but they are positively jubilant to see NATO collapse. Putin's war is not just a land grab. This is a war of ideas that the United States doesn't even know it's in. The war on the very concept of truth. The idea that democracy is a sham, that facts are fluid, that all governments are corrupt, all institutions are rotten, all leaders equally illegitimate. This is the war on truth, and it works. Because once you throw truth out, power is the only thing that matters. I mean, there's nothing hypothetical about this. The world is already on the path towards fascism. Just try to have a rational conversation about January 6th with someone you disagree with. Not a debate, not an argument, just a simple attempt to establish a basic ground truth that both parties can agree to. You will find yourself drowning in a deluge of what about BLM? What about Hillary? What about Twitter files? What about the Colorado case? It doesn't even matter how absurd the comparison is anymore. The goal is not good faith discussion. The goal is to render discussion impossible. We watched Donald Trump's use of this strategy in real time. Trump and Elon spent Election Day howling about massive fraud being perpetrated in Pennsylvania. And then, Trump actually flipped Pennsylvania. And just like that, the fraud narrative evaporated. No retractions, no apologies, just a silent pivot to the next outrage, the next manufactured scandal. This is straight out of the authoritarian playbook, and it's something Putin himself uses. The narrative is never fixed on the history of Europe and European countries, because the truth is never fixed. The moment something ceases to be useful, it disappears. And the unreachables in the MAGA cult are not just misinformed. They're being actively trained to accept whatever the party line is at any given moment. I guess one of those party lines snuck up on Marco Rubio during his Senate hearing, where he spent his opening remarks sounding like a very well-educated foreign policy expert, to which he was quickly admonished by Trump's sycophants in Congress as to pay respect to the party leader and say that none of this would be possible without Trump. And he then spent the rest of the Senate hearing bending the knee in this very abject way, ending all of his statements with the qualifying, but none of this would be possible without dear leader Trump. This is how authoritarian movements function, not by enforcing ideological purity, but by making ideology itself irrelevant and asking only for unquestioning loyalty to the leader. And yet, the most important development of 2024 seems to be that Trump is no longer some lone lunatic ranting in the wilderness. The war on reality now extends far beyond him. You've got new right figures like J.D. Vance and Christian nationalists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have mastered the art of weaving real grievances with outright lies, who understand that their audience is not looking for truth, but just for a justification to believe whatever suits them. Trump's war against the conservative establishment, against the Mitt Romneys and John McCain's, and the intellectual wing of the right, the typical intelligentsia conservative framework that failed him on January 6th, has led him into the open arms of the far right, a movement that doesn't even bother with a coherent ideology anymore. They weaponize real grievances, like identity politics, and use them to sneak in much more nefarious ideas. I know Trump's a deal maker, so if we can make the FAA less woke, is it a fair trade to expect the FAA to personally bend the knee to Trump? Is that the art of the deal? Is a loyalty test designed as remove all DEI, respond in 24 hours, email, so worth it? that we're willing to torch our relationship with Europe and be left at the mercy of Putin over it? There are legitimate critiques to be made about the role of these ideologies in shaping Western institutions. Wokeness and critical race theory are terrible. Blue-haired activists do not validate the lies and half-truths of Trump. J.D. Vance does not seek a genuine reckoning with wokeness. It's just an issue that riles the base up. This is the fundamental problem with the populist right's intellectual project. It relies on a series of provocations that masquerade as insight, while offering no meaningful alternative. It's not a movement grounded in policy or governance. It's a coalition of cowboys and grifters taking shots at imagined enemies within. J.D. Vance said this outright. Our real enemy is not China or Russia. It's the enemy within this room. Wonderful. And when Xi takes Taiwan, after watching Putin steamroll through Ukraine, will wokeness and NATO still be the greatest threats to human civilization? The New York Times, the intelligence community, those are the true villains, not the autocrats invading sovereign nations. All right, the result of this nonsense is an epistemic crisis, one in which there are no referees, no stable institutions that can impose reality upon those determined to reject it. Instead, we are left with a media ecosystem where Joe Rogan is a historian and Elon Musk can slouch into the Oval Office and unspool whatever COVID conspiracy theory comes to mind without so much as a raised eyebrow. We're watching the death of expertise in real time and watching it be replaced with a carnival of grift. And this is the world Trump has been elected into, lifted by the price of eggs and gasoline, by a disdain for wokeness and critical race theory, as he careens through every diplomatic convention, every fragile alliance, every system that once held the West intact. Not because he believes in anything, not because he has a plan. Trump is not a fascist in the way the left imagines. He's something worse, a man who believes in nothing beyond his own hype. His calculus is entirely transactional. Power, leverage, flattery, spectacle. And that's exactly what Putin has been waiting for. The unraveling of the West in a way that doesn't require tanks or soldiers or nuclear war. In a way that happens rhetorically, in quiet concessions, in unchallenged narratives, in a slow erosion of will. Orban dismantled democracy in Hungary in 8 years. Trump has the infrastructure, the energy, and the rogues gallery to do it in 6 months. So where are the adults in the room? The Times is documenting this like a nature photographer watching a gazelle get torn apart. Congress is muttering discontent while kneeling in submission. The so-called gatekeepers of democracy are failing the only test that ever mattered. I never thought I'd say this, but I miss Nancy Pelosi. So far, the Hakeem Jeffries leadership already appears arthritic and incompetent, and is afraid to so much as disturb the MAGA hive. What's lost in talking about all of this is any serious engagement with the complexity of the world. Ukraine's war is a test of whether liberal institutions still function. And for all their failures, they remain infinitely preferable to the alternative: the rule of law, democracy, free press. These are imperfect, but they contain within them the possibility of self-correction. So why are our institutions tolerating amateur hour?